The streets of Hong Kong in the late 1990s were a restless ocean of neon lights and shadows. Among the chaos of night markets, endless foot traffic, and the quiet hum of cheap karaoke bars, there was a darkness that few dared to look at closely. I didn't know it then, but this darkness was about to claim a life so brutally that it would forever haunt the city and anyone who dared to speak of it. Her name was Fan Man Yi, but the world would only remember her as the Hello Kitty murder victim. She wasn't famous. She wasn't rich. She was just another face lost among the thousands of working-class women fighting to survive in a city that could crush you if you faltered. Fan was born into hardship. The kind of hardship that doesn't just make life difficult, it brands you. Her childhood was not filled with toys or affection, but with absence. Abandoned by her family and placed in a girls' home, she grew up learning that no one was coming to save her. And when she aged out of the system, she carried with her one truth: survival was hers to fight for alone. By her late teens, she had already fallen into the fringes of Hong Kong's underground. Addiction to methamphetamine became both her escape and her prison. To support her habit, she turned to sex work, a choice that came with its own dangers. It wasn't glamorous and it wasn't safe, but for Fan, it was a way to keep going, one night at a time. That's when she met Chan Man Lok. Chan was no savior. He was the opposite, a small-time gangster with a taste for power and cruelty. He had money, but it wasn't clean. He had charm, but it was sharp-edged. People owed him favors, feared him, or worked for him because they had no choice. And when Fan crossed paths with him, their lives would collide in the worst possible way. The story goes that Fan stole something from Chan, a small amount of money, perhaps some drugs. Whatever it was enough to set him off. Men like Chan didn't forgive. They made examples, and for a woman like Fan, alone and addicted, the world was already stacked against her. But there's a detail often forgotten. Before she became a victim, Fan was still a person. She had friends. She had clients who saw her as more than just another night's transaction. Some even said she had a soft laugh, a habit of tucking her hair behind her ears when she was nervous. She liked Hello Kitty merchandise, a strange, innocent fascination for someone living in such a harsh world. That would become a chilling irony later. By early 1990, men, Leong Xing-cho and Leong Wei-lun, his accomplices, eager to follow orders, eager to prove themselves. What Fan didn't know was that this would be the last night she walked the streets of Hong Kong as a free woman. The building was ordinary enough, another aging high-rise in Kowloon. Its hallway smelled faintly of mildew and stale cigarettes, the kind of place where people came and went without neighbors asking questions. Behind the door of a cramped apartment, a horror story was about to begin. Inside, the walls were yellowed with nicotine stains. The curtains blocked out the city's neon glow, and the furniture was sparse. But there was one thing that stood out: a collection of toys and stuffed animals scattered around, including a giant Hello Kitty doll that leaned in the corner like a silent witness. Fan might have felt uneasy, but she didn't turn back. Maybe she thought this was just a meeting, just business. Maybe she believed she could talk her way out of trouble. Whatever she thought, it didn't matter, because once the door shut, the world outside no longer existed. The door closed with a dull thud, and something in that sound carried a finality that I couldn't shake. Fan probably felt it too. It's strange how silence can be louder than words, how the air shifts when danger steps into the room. Chan Manlok wasn't smiling that night. He didn't need to. The presence of his two accomplices, Leung Xingcho and Leung Wailun, was enough to make any negotiation one-sided. They were young, restless, and eager to prove themselves useful to their boss. The apartment smelled faintly of instant noodles and cheap cologne, but beneath it there was something sour, like old fear trapped in the walls. Fan was told to sit. Maybe she still thought this was about the debt. Maybe she still believed that words, pleading, or a promise could save her. But Chan wasn't interested in promises. He wanted control. And control, for men like him, came through fear. The first slap was sudden, a sharp crack that echoed off the walls. Then came another, harder, enough to split her lip. There were no cameras, no witnesses, just 3 men and a woman whose voice would soon be swallowed by the city's endless noise. Over the next few days, the apartment ceased to be a room. It became a cage. Fan was bound, her movements restricted, her pleas ignored. Chan's rage wasn't about money anymore. It was about power, about reminding her who held her life in his hands. They beat her when they were bored. They mocked her when she cried. Sometimes they ignored her. What makes this story even darker is that they weren't in hiding. They still lived their lives around the horror they created. They left the apartment to eat, to gamble, to walk the streets, knowing she was trapped inside. And every time they returned, the walls seemed to close in tighter. Imagine being in that room. The dim light from a flickering bulb, the stale air heavy with cigarette smoke, the sound of traffic far below, so distant it may as well be another world. And in the corner, the giant Hello Kitty doll, pink, cheerful, oblivious, watching it all like a silent witness to something unspeakable. Fan must have hoped someone would notice, but no one came. The neighbors kept their doors shut, the city too busy to care about one missing woman. At some point, fear became exhaustion. The body can only take so much. Fan's injuries worsened. She couldn't stand without help. Her voice grew weak. And still, they didn't stop. It's said that at times they treated her like a toy, something to be broken, repaired just enough, and broken again. They taunted her, told her she was worthless, that no one would even miss her. And maybe the cruelest part, there were moments when they acted casual. They played video games, ate meals, even laughed in the same room where she suffered. It's a kind of evil that doesn't need chaos. It thrives in normalcy. There's a detail that chills me every time I think about it. Fan liked Hello Kitty merchandise. It was a small thing, maybe a reminder of a childhood she never really had. And in that very apartment, surrounded by violence and mockery, that innocent symbol sat in the background, as if mocking the fragile line between innocence and horror. By the end of the second week, Fan's strength was gone. Her face was swollen, her body covered in bruises and burns. She was slipping, and everyone in that room knew it. But mercy wasn't in Chan's vocabulary. One night, they went further than before. The details blur in witness accounts, but it's believed she collapsed after a prolonged beating. Whether it was an accident or intent didn't matter. What mattered was that Chan and his men were now standing in a small apartment with a dying woman. And here's where the story crosses a line most people can't imagine. They didn't stop to call for help. They didn't panic. They simply kept going, letting cruelty turn into something colder. Fan Man Yi's life was hanging by a thread, and in that room, there was no compassion left to save her. There comes a point when pain stops being pain and turns into something else, a cold, distant numbness. By the third week inside that Kowloon apartment, Fan Man Yi was no longer the woman who walked in. Her body was battered, her spirit exhausted, and whatever fight she had left was slipping through her like water in a cracked glass. The apartment curtains were still drawn tight. The hallway still smelled of mildew and cheap smoke. Life outside went on. Buses roared, people shopped, couples argued. But inside that small, dim room, time stood still. Witnesses later said she was barely conscious toward the end. Chan Man-lok and his accomplices no longer saw her as a person. She was an object, a problem, something they could toy with. The burns, the cuts, the swelling, every mark told a story of cruelty. It's believed that around this time, the violence stopped having a point. The death, the anger, those were excuses. Now it was about dominance, a kind of control that needed no reason. They mocked her frailty, jeered at her silence. The younger men even bragged to others, as if what they were doing was some twisted achievement. Fan's health deteriorated rapidly. She could barely eat. She drifted in and out of consciousness, her small frame shrinking. There were times she begged them to stop. Other times she said nothing at all, just stared blankly at the floor. One evening, the cruelty crossed the final threshold. No one knows if they intended to kill her that night or if it just happened. The details are murky, buried in conflicting testimonies, but the result was the same. Fan collapsed. Whether it was a blow, untreated injuries, or sheer exhaustion, her body could no longer fight. The room fell silent. For the first time, the laughter stopped. There she was, still, fragile, a life fading in the corner of a room that smelled of sweat and smoke. Some say she might have died slowly, slipping away while they watched. Others believe it was quicker, the result of a final act of violence. What's clear is that when she took her last breath, no one tried to save her. Think about that, a life ending not with comfort or kindness, but in a room where the walls were stained with cruelty. There were no last words, no prayers, no gentle hands. Just silence. What followed is something that still chills investigators to this day. Fan was dead, but for Chan and the others, this wasn't the end. Death wasn't a full stop. It was a complication. A body needed to be dealt with, and what they chose to do next is the reason this case became one of the most disturbing in Hong Kong's history. They didn't run. They didn't call anyone. They simply carried on. Imagine the coldness it takes to sleep in the same apartment where a dead woman lies in the next room. Imagine cooking dinner, playing games, while the air grows heavy with something unspeakable. The men decided the body couldn't stay whole. It's hard to even write this, but the truth is what it is. They began to cut. Not all at once, not clean. This wasn't the work of professionals. It was chaotic, cruel. Fan's body was reduced to something unrecognizable. The details are grim,
cheerful, cartoonish, the kind of thing you'd give to a child. And it was here, in this place of horror, that the doll would take on a meaning so twisted it would burn into the city's memory. The men kept her skull. They cleaned it, boiled it, stripped it of any trace of life, and placed it inside the head of that Hello Kitty doll. Why? Perhaps as a trophy, perhaps as a sick joke, perhaps because, to them, she was no longer human. That smiling face, stitched and harmless, became the mask for something unspeakable. And while the world outside went about its business, inside that apartment, a silent witness stood in the corner, a stuffed toy with a secret no one could imagine. For weeks, the apartment held its silence, but secrets never stay hidden forever, and soon the cruelty that thrived in the shadows would crawl into the light. The body was gone, but the horror remained. You'd think a death would sober people, make them realize what they'd done. But not in that Kowloon apartment. Chan Man-lok and his accomplices didn't panic. They didn't show remorse. They simply shifted gears, from tormentors to cleaners. The apartment smelled different now. The stale cigarette smoke and instant noodles mixed with something heavier, something metallic and unmistakable. Fan Man-yi was no longer there in body, but the memory of her suffering clung to every wall, every piece of furniture. And still, they stayed. At some point, Chan made a decision. The body couldn't be found. They had to erase her, piece by piece, and so they did. The details, as recorded later, were horrifying. The men cut and boiled the remains using the same kitchen where they cooked their meals. They stripped everything they could, disposing of what they thought would never be traced. They turned a home into a place of dissection and destruction. But one thing they didn't discard was her skull. Why keep it? Maybe it was arrogance, maybe it was a twisted kind of trophy. But whatever the reason, they decided to hide it in plain sight. There, leaning against the wall in the corner of the living room, sat a giant Hello Kitty doll. Pink bow, wide eyes, cheerful smile. It had been there the whole time, a silent spectator, and now it became something far more sinister. The men hollowed it out. They placed the cleaned skull inside the head of the doll, sewing it back up like nothing had changed. On the outside, it was still soft, harmless, a toy. But inside, it carried the last remains of a woman whose life had been stolen. Weeks passed. They went on with their lives, gambling, hanging out, inviting people over. Imagine that, visitors sitting in that room, maybe laughing, maybe glancing at the stuffed toy without a second thought, completely unaware of what it contained. But secrets have a way of rotting through even the sometimes stayed with Chan. She wasn't part of the crime, but she saw things, she heard things, and she felt fear. One day, she spoke. When she finally told someone what had happened, her words spilled out like a nightmare. The beatings, the screams, the boiling, the doll. Few believed her at first. It sounded too insane, too grotesque. But she was insistent. And that's when the case began to unravel. The police took her seriously. When they arrived at the apartment, they expected something grim, but nothing could prepare them for what they found. The place looked ordinary, dirty but ordinary. Yet as they searched, the pieces began to emerge. There were traces, tools, scraps, remnants of things that shouldn't have been there. And then they saw it, the Hello Kitty doll. At first, it seemed ridiculous, but when they opened it, the joke ended. Inside the plush head, beneath the stitched smile, was the truth. Imagine being that officer, holding something meant for children and finding a human skull inside. It was the kind of discovery that doesn't leave you. The news spread fast. Reporters swarmed, headlines screamed. Hello Kitty murder became the name whispered in streets and broadcast on every channel. Hong Kong, a city used to crime, had never seen something like this. A murder wrapped in innocence. A stuffed toy turned into a coffin. As evidence was gathered, the picture became clear. This wasn't a quick crime or an accident. It was prolonged, deliberate cruelty. And now the entire city knew it. Chan Man-lok and his accomplices were arrested. Their faces, once hidden in the shadows, were now plastered on every newspaper. The public wanted answers, they wanted justice. But nothing could erase the image of that doll, sitting in the corner like a smiling mask for horror. By the time the police peeled back the layers of that small Kowloon apartment, the story was no longer just about a missing woman. It was a horror that demanded answers, and Hong Kong, a city that prided itself on speed and efficiency, slowed down to stare. The Hello Kitty murder, they called it. The words alone were strange, almost comical if you didn't know the weight they carried. But behind them was something grotesque, something that left even seasoned detectives unsettled. The officers who recovered the evidence described the scene as a contradiction. There were ordinary things, cheap furniture, scattered dishes, cigarette butts, game consoles. And then there were the fragments of a nightmare. Bones, tissue traces, tools stained with something that no cleaning could fully hide. And of course, the doll, pink bow, stitched smile, hollow head hiding a skull. The girl who spoke up, the teenage witness, became a key to the case. Her testimony was vivid. She described the days Fawn spent trapped, the sounds she heard, the mocking voices, the cruelty that turned routine into ritual. She had seen the skull inside the doll. She had seen Chan's
casual disregard for life. When the arrests came, the three men looked almost unremarkable. Chan Man-luk, the leader, was older, heavier, with the kind of face you wouldn't notice in a crowd. The other two, Young Sing-cho and Young Wai-lung, were younger, less hardened, but eager to follow. Their mugshots were published, their names repeated, and suddenly they were infamous. The trial became a spectacle. Courtrooms filled with reporters, sketches of the Hello Kitty doll printed on front pages, every detail dissected. People wanted to know why. Why so much cruelty for a small debt? Why keep the skull? Was it arrogance or something darker? The defense tried to frame it as a crime gone wrong, an addiction-fueled spiral. They argued there was no intent to kill, that Fan's death was accidental, the result of prolonged abuse and neglect, rather than premeditation. But the prosecution had the weight of testimony and evidence on their side. In court, the stuffed doll was mentioned often, its cheerful face an eerie contrast to the facts being read aloud. The jurors heard about the burns, the beatings, the boiling of body parts. They heard about the men laughing, eating, sleeping near a corpse. And the teenage witness, young but unshaken, stood there and told them what she saw. When the verdict came, it was chilling in its own way. The men were found guilty, not of murder, but of manslaughter and unlawful imprisonment. Because the exact moment and cause of Fan's death could not be proven, the law could only go so far. Each received a sentence that many believed was far too light for the crime: life imprisonment with the possibility of parole. But the legal outcome didn't erase the memory. The public was horrified, angry. Mothers held their children closer. Apartment doors were locked tighter. And that doll, its image lingered. Toy shops saw sales drop, and Hello Kitty, once a symbol of harmless fun, became a whispered reminder of something unspeakable. For years after, people talked about the case. TV specials, documentaries, even whispered rumors turned it into something almost mythic. The story traveled beyond Hong Kong, carried by headlines around the world. And every time someone mentioned it, that image returned. A smiling doll in a dark room, hiding a skull inside. But at the center of it all was still a woman who had a name, a voice, a life that never should have ended that way. Fan Man-yi wasn't just a victim. She was someone who lacked conversations. And if you ever walk through Kowloon at night, past the old high-rises, where secrets hide behind locked doors, you might wonder how many other stories remain untold. But one thing's for certain. Sometimes the scariest monsters aren't hiding under beds or wearing masks. Sometimes they're just ordinary people living ordinary lives, until the door closes and the world outside never knows.